Hey everyone, it's Jen.
And this is Lindsay.
And welcome back to Corpus Delicti. We are now venturing into Chapter 3, Dirty Laundry.
Again, if you are just joining us, this is now the third part of a 5-ish part series. Still kind of waiting to see how all that falls out. But so if you have not heard part 1 and 2, you need to go back. When we left off last time, we were about halfway through Rocky's trial. But before we pick that up, we actually have some updates that we want to provide. We seriously, every time we turn around, are learning something new about this case, finding something else, finding an archived something. And just when I think we've got it all, we find something else. So a few things that we want to elaborate on before we pick up on the trial. So there was a newspaper article that we found from the day after Ludie Mae Tucker was murdered, and it said that they were unsure if this attack was related to the other invasions on elderly people. So apparently there had been other invasions in the community targeted towards elderly people. They said that this one was different because no one else had died. It's the only one that turned fatal, but there had been other attacks, which is really important, I think, because who was in the area at the time of those? Did anyone go back and look and say, was Rocky around those? Was Cool Breeze around those? Was anyone else around those that we haven't looked at yet? So that's kind of a big deal there.
Also, Miss Tucker did have a boyfriend, and they had gotten into a verbal argument that evening. However, her cousin at the time said she was sure it was not him who had come to the house. She would have recognized his voice. Plus, nothing else added up that it would have been the boyfriend.
Yeah, it's similar to Rocky. She could have just said, hey, it was him, instead of explaining everything.
And this was the biggest bombshell that we had found out just today, that before Cool Breeze was arrested, there were three other suspects on the list who they wanted to try and run prints against. Now, we're not sure why they were suspects, but they did have track records which were consistent with theft. Not sure if they were followed up on them or how they were eliminated. We're still combing through some extra documents to see if it's there, but we don't have that just yet.
What I am thinking in my head here is that they've got these guys maybe based on similar history. They want to at least look at them. Maybe they fit the description. Then Cool Breeze comes along. They think they've got the guy, so they never go back and look at those guys. And then comes Rocky. So maybe it's as simple as they just thought they had the right guy. Another thing that we did confirm is we talked in the last episode about the jury selection and how you try to get an impartial jury, but you have to try, if you see something wrong with a potential juror, you have to step up and challenge it. Well, John Mays, Rocky's attorney, he and Larry Madison did try to strike some of the jurors, but it was actually denied. So they saw some of the problems with those jurors and they said, hey, we see something here that we don't like. We think it's going to hinder this trial. And it was denied.
They also had allotted for $1,000 for an investigator for the defense. That really isn't a lot to go on, especially when you're having to do a lot of footwork, a lot of interviewing, and trying to find out who really did the murder. $1,000 does not go very far.
Well, think about a professional investigator. Is that a week's salary? I don't know if that's high or low, but that can't get you too terribly far in a case where there's not much evidence and you're having to do, like you said, a lot of footwork where you're talking to people and all that. And we had also talked in the last episode about the possibility of there being 2 VCRs. We did find 2 statements where 2 different people involved in the case said that they didn't have a reason to believe that there were 2 VCRs. One of them was one of the officers. The other one, I want to say was John Mays, but I'll have to go back and look. But 2 people said, I don't think there were 2 VCRs. My question is, though, we know they did not actively go search the shot house. So can we actually really be sure?
So let's get back to the case. And right now we are about halfway through the trial.
let's pick right up with the next witness, which is Marzell Ewing. So I know there's a lot of players in this case, so we're going to do our best to try to put reminders out there about who is who. But if you remember, he was the one who was arrested for stealing a car, and he implicated Rocky. He said, yeah, I saw him sell the VCR. So Marzell Ewing gets up on the stand. He admits to helping Butch sell his drugs. He says twice that day he went over to Butch's. Sometime between 2 and 3 in the afternoon, he was there helping Butch wax his car, and Rocky came up to buy drugs. He had known Rocky for about a year, so he vouched for him with Butch. We know Butch is that businessman. He doesn't want to get into the wrong person's hands, but Marzell is like, yeah, that's Rocky. He's cool.
Later that night, he went back over, and this is going to be about 9 o'clock. We're going to do a little Q&A because this is the trial. Lindsay is going to pick up her role for the prosecutor and the defense, and I'm going to revise my Emmy-winning performance as the person on the stand.
While you were sitting over there that evening, did you see anybody bring in a VCR?
Yes.
Can you tell us about what time that was?
It was late that night. It was somewhere around midnight or 1 o'clock.
Who did you see bring in the VCR?
Robin.
The defendant over there that you've identified?
Yes.
What did he do with the VCR when he came in?
He brought it in and laid it up there, and Butch looked at it, and they made transactions. And he started walking towards the door, and he told him it better work. He said it did.
All right, so there he's kind of setting the timeline, when he saw Rocky, what he said, and all that. He goes on to say that he, Marzell Ewing, stayed at the shot house until about 4 or 5 that morning, which was after Butch left. Now let's cut back to Butch's testimony for a second, because remember, Butch said that he packed up for the night a few minutes after Rocky left. He sold the VCR, hung out for just a few minutes, and then he's done. So keep this in mind, because now Marzell Ewing has Rocky arriving sometime between midnight and 1 o'clock, leaving right after selling the VCR. Rocky didn't hang around, so that timeline doesn't match up with what we heard. However, Marzell says, well, Butch didn't leave right away after selling the VCR, and he hung out for a while that night. But again, there's a lot more about Marzell and why he's telling this story to come, and that's actually in the next episode, so don't put too much faith in that.
Now, Sergeant Hale, one of the men who interviewed Rocky when he was arrested, testified next. Much of this was the same as we have already discussed. He did make particular note that Rocky said he never touched the victim's phone or anything, even though they never asked. Now, the sergeant thought that this was weird or peculiar, that he just offered this information. The interview isn't recorded, so there is no way to verify that the police did not hint to him about, did you touch the phone? Did you go in the house? Did you ever go in to make an order for fast food or delivery food? So we don't know if it was suggested to him or if he just offers this up.
But to be fair, it's in the newspapers. It's information that's out there. And also, are people talking about it because it was in the newspaper? And this also wasn't a statement that Rocky gave and signed. This is them going off their own recollection. So after Rocky leaves, they're writing down a summary of it. So it's not a word-for-word recollection. He also said that at one point, Rocky stopped answering questions. And he had told him at one point, Rocky, you're looking at possibly a life sentence. And Rocky responded by saying, I could do a life sentence standing on my head. And while Sergeant Hale is talking about all this on the stand, he's saying it in a way that implied guilt. He's kind of like, well, he stopped answering our questions as soon as we started talking about murder and all that. Well, that's actually a smart thing to do. That's what you're supposed to do. And the whole statement where Rocky says, I could do a life sentence standing on my head, Rocky's playing tough guy. He's talking big here. He's trying not to be intimidated, because a lot of times a life sentence implies parole, which can be finished in 7 years, 10 years, 15 years. So he's saying, no big deal. I could do that easily. So I have no reason to lie to you. You're not scaring me. I wouldn't lie to you because I could do this sentence.
This is one of those points where Mays really stepped up and did a great job being his lawyer, because Mays totally called him out and said this doesn't indicate anything, and that if he wasn't scared of a life sentence, he has no reason to lie to you. After this, Dr. Kenneth Warner testified about the autopsy. Now, we are not going to go into a lot of detail here because we already know the details of her 4 stab wounds. But there is one thing that we did want to touch on. He talked about how there was blood in the pericardial cavity in the left chest cavity. That's not really normally where blood goes.
So next up, we have Roger Morrison. He is from the serology department, and he is going to talk about Cool Breeze's clothes because, as we know, Mrs. Tucker and Miss Dutton described the attacker as wearing a white shirt, had blood on it, and we know that other people have said they've seen Rocky in dark clothing. Well, Roger Morrison was given clothing from Cool Breeze Anthony Ballantyne's home, and there was a small blood stain found on the left side of the shirt, and it was about 1/8 of an inch in diameter to 1/4 of an inch in diameter. So Roger Morrison takes this blood, tests it. It's not from Miss Tucker. It's not from Miss Dutton. And it was the same type in all respects that were actually tested to Anthony Ballantyne. So in other words, it was most likely his own blood. So let's be honest, that's really not that big of a blood stain, right? But keep in mind the testimony from the autopsy. Miss Tucker's wounds were not deep, except for one, and a lot of the blood was leaking into those cavities, which is what Jen described, as well as out. All that to say, the blood may not have been, pardon the lack of a better description, but may not have been just totally flying out onto the killer, if that makes sense. And there's actually a theory about this. Remember, Officer Tilley said that Miss Tucker told him that the killer was wearing a plaid shirt at first. Now, that's the only time we hear about the plaid shirt, so we don't know if he misheard, they misheard, it wasn't actually plaid or it was. But could it have been an unbuttoned plaid shirt sitting over the white shirt? Hence, only a tiny bit of blood got on the white shirt. So let's say for a moment that this was Cool Breeze and he's wearing a white shirt. He's got a plaid shirt on over it. He injures himself somehow. We know that happens a lot in stabbings. He takes off the plaid shirt after the murder, throws it away thinking everything is on that outer shirt, which just leaves that white shirt. And that's how he gets blood on it, not realizing it's there.
Also, Miss Tucker didn't specify if the man arrived with the blood or left with the blood on the shirt. So, if, big if, he was the killer, we're not saying that he is, but should he have had more blood on him that wasn't his own? Now, again, that covering shirt is a theory. But remember, he was seen with a bleeding hand earlier that night, and it was a cut. Now, if you remember back to the 911 call, she kept saying a cut. A cut. So we assume when we first see the words from the 911 call, we're thinking she is cut, but she's stabbed. So could she have been pointing out that her killer had a cut on his hand because she was in the middle of trying to describe the attacker? However, there was a picture of Breeze in the evidence where he did indeed have a skinned knuckle that could have caused some bleeding.
So next we have John Kilborn. He's a trace evidence analyst, and he studied Miss Tucker's clothing for any hair, anything like that, any sort of how we talked about in the last series, the touch DNA, anything like that that might be on these clothes that they could use. The only thing that he found was a hair from a Caucasian, which could have been her own. Now, hair, it has to have certain properties. It's not a perfect science, but it could have been her own hair. It was not that of a black male. Nothing else was found. So let's pause here because we got to bring up another point that's talked about a lot in reference to this case. Remember back to episode 1. Rocky suffered from severe eczema. His skin was known to crack and flake, yet they found no skin cells anywhere. We also said that it caused his hair to fall out. There was no hair anywhere. And the officers who interviewed Rocky originally even remember seeing his arms in pretty bad shape during the interview, and they recalled seeing it peeling off. So that was definitely a thing. And also, let's remember Miss Tucker's injuries. We talked about how they kind of gradually travel down her body. They start up at the shoulder, then it's kind of near the stomach. I'm not an expert, but it has always made me wonder if the killer fell and, got that first stab in and then had fallen maybe to his knees or something like that. Which, if that's the case, and if it were Rocky, surely there would have been some trace of skin.
So let's keep on with the dirty laundry. Johnny Croker comes next and talks about how he was the one who went through Breeze's laundry. They also found a knife which had a broken handle. Now, is it the knife? We don't know, because it could have been the same type. Note this as well. They went through Rocky's house. They did not find anything such as clothing or a murder weapon that matched anything. Now, he only had maybe 5 to 6 pairs of clothing, none of which matched the description that she gave to the police or the 911 operator. This is back speaking to Johnny Crocker. He tells how Percy Yarbrough brought him the VCR and how they had dusted it for prints. Now remember, Yarbrough brought the VCR from the shot house to the police station, so it had relatively touched Rocky's hands, Butch's hands, his sister's hands, possibly his sister's hands, and now Percy's. I mean, that's a lot of people in one night touching this VCR.
And let's go back to the knife for just a second, because it was the right size and type of knife. But when you're talking about this type of knife, it's common. And so that's why we say, is it the knife? We don't know. It could have been, but it also could not have been. Lots of people carry pocket knives and small knives. So that, unfortunately, there wasn't a whole lot of testing done on the knife to see. Now, they found it, they took it, but that's all that they really got from it. Next is Dwight Hale. He is one of those who questioned Rocky. We've already talked about it. We talked about it in the last episode. He says the questioning with Rocky took about 3.5 to 4 hours. Nothing major there. But next up is Tracy Wolf. Here's where the timeline starts to get really important. So remember how we talked about Marzelle Ewing saying that Butch didn't leave right after Rocky sold the VCR and all that? So Tracy Wolf worked at the hotel that Butch says he stayed in that night. Remember, he left the shot house, went and stayed in a hotel. She checked Butch into the hotel after he closed up shop on this night in question, and receipts show that he checked in around 5 a.m. So this is important because he says that he had people put the VCR away, and then he called it a night. He went to Waffle House, which was about an hour before he checked into the hotel. This all is from his statement, which would be about approximately 4 a.m. Checked in at 5 a.m., Waffle House 4 a.m., plus travel time. So he may have packed up around, let's say, 3:30 in the morning.
Butch himself said that between the second and third and final time that Rocky appeared, there was an hour in between. Now, Marzelle said Rocky came sometime between midnight and 1. However, he also says that Butch didn't leave right after Rocky left. So this would have had Rocky at the shot house much later in the evening, and Tyrone Elliott and that crew said he saw him right after the murder. So if Butch didn't leave the house until 3:30 and he left shortly after Rocky left, that would have put Rocky at the shot house between 3 and 3:30. Why Tyrone supposedly saw him a little bit after midnight.
Right.
That's a 3-hour difference.
That's a big difference. But Willie Reese Raybon, who is Roadrunner, was there during this time. So he comes up next. And we're going to cover a lot of this. There's a lot here. So remember in the last episode when we talked about the opening statements and how Rocky's lawyer, Mr. Mays, he was taking the route of showing all these people as liars. He's like, they're all lying. They're all, you can't trust them. He said that Roadrunner, Willie Reese Raybon, was the worst. And this is the quote. He says, by the time he gets through testifying, most of you will feel like asking the bailiff for a can of Lysol after he leaves the stand. So here he is, Willie Reese Raybon, a.k.a. Roadrunner. He is one of several who says that he saw Cool Breeze come by 3 times that night. So we're going to go back to our role play. I'll be the attorneys. Jen is going to be Willie Reese, Roadrunner. This alleyway back here, while you were working for Butch Madden, did you ever run across any stolen property or items which had been hidden or stashed in that alleyway?
Yes, sir.
Did you find stolen property frequently or infrequently stashed in that alleyway?
Frequently.
Did you stash some there yourself on occasion?
Yes, sir.
So here he is, one of those several people we talked about saying that this alley is a dump spot. So later on, this was said about Breeze coming back to the house after saying earlier he would be back. Remember, Breeze at one point said, "I'll be back, man, I'll be back." And then he did come back. So we're picking up again. He had a bag with him?
Yes, sir.
What was he wearing?
To me, it was like a white sweatshirt.
All right. Did you observe whether or not he was bleeding?
He had blood on his hands and a little bit on his shirt, and he was sweating really hard.
When he left, did Cool Breeze have that plastic bag with him?
No, sir, I didn't see it.
So then they move on to asking him about Rocky. Okay, now a VCR was brought to the crack house in the early morning hours of October 5th, 1991.
Yes, sir.
Who brought it?
Rocky.
When Rocky brought the VCR to the crack house, how was Rocky dressed?
I'd say it was a tan shirt. I would say a jacket like this, but I'm not sure though.
What color?
Brownish tan.
Did he have on anything white?
I didn't see white.
So again, here's our brown clothes. The killer was wearing white. There was nothing white or that fit the description found in Rocky's house.
Then they ask him why he lied. And his rationale for this is, quote, because they were beating on the desk and they had slung a picture, and I just told them what they wanted to hear. He goes on to say that they talked and asked me about it right then. I didn't give them nothing, no information. And then they kept on talking to me and gave me some information about Breeze. I assumed it was Breeze because of the plastic bag. That plastic bag must not have had the VCR because Rocky brought it later. So given his first conversation with the police, he was thinking that Cool Breeze had the VCR in the plastic bag. And that's what the whole police report was saying. He realizes whatever was in that plastic bag was not the VCR. So that was this whole conversation trying to get around is, who actually brought it into the house.
He does say that one time that night when Breeze came by, he was in a Chrysler Cordova with some other people. He was not driving. He was a passenger. That will be important in a moment. So back to our questioning. Did you have a discussion with Leon Madden about that VCR wherein Leon Madden told you if the police ask you about it, you were to say you knew nothing about it?
No, sir. He told me not to say nothing about the drugs, the cocaine. He told me also that if we tell them, they will get our felony cases off our back. But at that time, I had 15 years.
So we don't know if this is true or not, but keep this in mind because it could be relevant later on in the next episode. He does specify that it was Butch, which is Leon Madden, his street name is Butch, who told him this, not the police. So the police weren't saying, we'll get these felonies off your back, but it came from Butch, who said the police said this.
And remember, Butch, we think, is a confidential informant at the time.
So back to the questioning. Did you ever tell them during this 2 or 3 hour interview that it wasn't Cool Breeze?
No.
So that he never even tries to say that it was Rocky. At least Butch said, I tried to tell him it was Rocky. They wouldn't believe me, but he's saying, I didn't even try.
He says how he's known Breeze all of his life, that they even went to church together. He also read a statement that when he implicated Breeze, he had about 8 beers and some whiskey. He had also smoked crack. If you're me, and if I were to intake that amount of alcohol and drugs, I would be flat out on my butt.
Yeah. Can he even remember anything?
But you've got to think he is a habitual user and a habitual drinker. So his tolerance may be a lot higher than what we hear that and we're like, oh my gosh, that's horrible. He should have been passed out, drooling on himself. But if you're a habitual user, that could be just as normal.
But 8 beers and some whiskey, that's a lot. But all that to say, he was not in his completely normal state of mind that night.
He wasn't on point, for sure.
Right. And again, that came from his statement. So they pull his original statement back out while he's on the stand. And they're like, well, in your statement, you said that you had a bunch to drink and all this. And the statement also says that Breeze was wearing dark clothes. So they're like, wait a minute, your original statement said that Breeze was wearing dark clothes. You just told us tonight he was wearing light clothes. And he goes, okay, look, I've told you now it was actually Rocky. As you're reading my statement, replace Breeze's name with Rocky in that statement. And that's what really happened. So in this scenario, this would mean that it would have had to have been Rocky wearing dark clothes as well as a hat like a toboggan. Okay, so he says, I told y'all it was Breeze. I lied. I'm saying it's Rocky. But take Breeze's name and replace it with Rocky in the statement, and it's true. So they're like, oh, okay, well, then that would have Rocky in dark clothes. That adds up. But there's a little more to it than that. This statement also says that Breeze arrived in a car with some other folks. Now, this is going to be that Chrysler Cordova that we just talked about a moment ago. Rocky didn't have a car. He wasn't with anyone that night. Breeze was. We've already heard that. So that right there tells you that you can't just take Breeze's name and put Rocky in its place, and that's how the story really goes. We know that immediately just from this. And then it goes on to say the second time Breeze came back, which he's trying now to say is Rocky, he was also in a car with other people. Again.
The third time when Rocky was supposedly coming back, he was doing it at a run with the VCR. They also point out that the statement never mentioned anything about this plastic bag that seems to keep popping into the narrative. So Roadrunner is up on the stand, and he's saying to the court, Butch set the VCR out by the wooden bench on the outside. Butch left about 2 a.m., I guess it was. I was spending the night over there. And about 20 minutes after the VCR had been brought from Breeze, the police were everywhere. Now, this completely conflicts with our timeline. Any timeline presented by any of the witnesses, not just ours, just to be that. So the police arrive at 12:19. This is fact. We have the police records, the dispatch logs of the police, and this was also meaning that the VCR was sold right at the 12 o'clock hour and got to the shot house before the police came, which would have had Miss Tucker dying before midnight. We know that's not true because the police got there in 2 minutes. They got in the 911 call and the police arriving at 12:19. She couldn't have died before the midnight hour. So we know that none of this timeline, and I think Lindsay and I have a really good idea of what the timeline may be, which I think we'll get into that later.
Yeah, but again, that's in reference to this line where he says, about 20 minutes after the VCR had been bought from Breeze, the police was everywhere. But here is a super interesting piece, speaking of the VCR. Think about the VCR being turned into police and what we know about that, what we've heard up to this point, because this is also from Roadrunner's original police statement that they read while he's on the stand. That night, I got with Butch and he was scared. Everybody knew that the old lady had been killed. Butch told me something wasn't right about her VCR. Butch had the VCR in the back of his Cadillac. Butch told me Sunday that he found out some way that the serial number on that VCR matched the one that had been took from the woman that got killed. He told me that he took it to Percy to get him to bring it on over to the police department. That Sunday, Butch called and said the police were going to talk to me and he needed to get with me. Butch took me to the station, and while he was riding, he told me not to tell how he got possession of the VCR. That's why I didn't tell you anything when you first talked to me.
But this is not the story that Percy, the neighbor, gave.
It sure isn't.
The neighbor said that he went over to his sister's house to find out more about it. And then his sister was like, that VCR? Come see in the back room. Are you sure it's a VCR? And that's how it got to the police, because she was like, get it out, get it out, get it out.
And he specifically testified to say no one else ever had possession of this VCR. And now someone's saying that Butch had it in his trunk. And the other thing that strikes me as strange here, he told me not to tell how he got possession of the VCR. At this point, they know you have the VCR. They know you had it. Why wouldn't you want to say someone else sold it to me? Because that passes the buck. That gets you off the hook. That gives you a reason for having it. Why wouldn't you want to tell that story? Or is that not the story?
So here is a great question. Roadrunner or Percy? Because I don't think either one is the whole truth.
I don't know, because nothing makes sense. It's hard to say. What it makes me think of, if I'm being 100% honest in my non-professional strictly opinion, I think they're all covering for something. I just don't know what it is. Because nothing makes sense. Nothing.
Ludi May's life gets taken, which is a horrible event. The police show up. The VCR is dumped by the killer in this back alleyway that is not on the main street, but it's near a main street, because some person in a car called to him, and that's why he stashed it. We know it's a he just because of the stature, and we're pretty sure it's not a girl because of what the victim said, short, stocky, black male. So we know it's pretty much not a girl. Rocky picks it up, sells it for crack, and then that's it. Who knows about the missing VCR? The police and her cousin. How does the information about the missing VCR get back to the shot house? They say it's because of Percy, because Percy knows and was questioned about a VCR. So we can't confirm that Percy knew about it the next day when talking to the police about the VCR. What we don't have is the police report with Roadrunner with the police, how he got the VCR. In this statement, he was with the VCR in the Cadillac with Butch.
To take it to Percy to give to the police, correct. Which, why wouldn't you just take it if you're going there? Why wouldn't you just take it if it's in your trunk? Unless you're trying to distance yourself from that VCR. Which, again, why would you need to do that if someone brought it to you? Why didn't he just take it himself? He was going to the police station to talk to him. If he had it in his trunk, why didn't he just take it with him? Because he's trying to distance himself. I can't help but think that's why. And so he's like, oh, Percy, I need you to take this for me. But why would you need to do that if someone sold it to you and you could easily say, look, I don't know where this person got this thing, but here's who gave it to me. That's why I can't help but think that there's something that they're all covering.
To add to that, we know he's a confidential informant.
Yeah.
Why wouldn't he just go to his handler and say, look,
yep,
I didn't have anything to do with Ludi May. I didn't have anything to do with that situation, but someone brought this to me. Here's the person who brought it to me. It's now yours.
And this, what we are talking about right here, is another reason why some people think that there were still two VCRs. Now, again, we said at the beginning that some of the actual professionals in this case said they did not think so, but these are the reasons why some of that is still out there. Long story short, with Roadrunner, both sides basically tear him up. They're pointing out every lie. So let's move on because we still have a lot to cover.
Next up is Donald Hood. Now, this is Rocky's brother-in-law. He says he was with Rocky that night at his mother's house just pretty much the whole day. They had plans to go out to the club that night. So it's going to be the two of them and Hood's girlfriend.
Now, this is his wife's brother, just FYI. Debbie, Rocky's wife. This is Debbie's brother, Donald.
They all wanted to leave before 11 o'clock, but didn't end up leaving till 11:30. Rocky wasn't there, so you know what? They said that they just were going to leave them. Rocky had left to go change clothes. He had borrowed a sweater from Donald, and he was supposed to meet them back at Hood's mother's house, his mother-in-law's house. But he wasn't there, and they were all ready. So, you know, back in your clubbing days, if someone wasn't there, you were just going to leave them.
Just to elaborate, because this will be important, this house, which is Donald Hood's mother's house, so Rocky's mother-in-law's house, is quite literally 1 block behind Rocky. So it's on the corner, but 1 block behind him.
So next up is Rita Hood. Possibly related to Donald and Deputy, but we're not 100% positive on that genealogy. These timelines are very important. So this is where we're going to ask you to kind of turn it up a little bit and pay attention. She was actually with Breeze that night. Her and Breeze and Skeet, now that's her brother, that's his nickname. They took the car, the Chrysler, over to the shot house. This lines up with what Roadrunner said. She said that they went sometime between 10:30 and 11. Now, this is before the murder. Of course, Roadrunner is now saying that it was Rocky in the statement, not Breeze. So, we know that's not true. We know that it was Rita, Cool Breeze, and Skeet. Those were the 3 in the car. They stayed about 10 minutes. Now, this is at the shot house. This would have been long enough for them to get a quick buy of crack and maybe have a drink.
Remember, other people have seen them here. They remember Breeze pulling up in this car and getting out. So it's not like we're just saying, oh, Rita Hood said this, so we know it's true. Other people, there are very few things in this story that actually line up. This is one of them.
This is one of them. Now, after they leave, they went to Rita's apartment. Rita's apartment was approximately 5 buildings down from Miss Tucker's. Same side of the road. So if your back is to Miss Tucker's house, it's going to be on your left. 5 houses down. These are not big country blocks. These are your regular run-of-the-mill city blocks.
So when they leave the shot house, they were only there 10 minutes. Remember, they said they went there about 10:30, 11 o'clock. When they arrive, Angela Acklin comes running up, and they specifically say running. Her dress was torn, and they're like, Angela, what in the world happened? And she says that she had been in a fight and whatever, but did they want to hang out? They're like, sure. So the 4 of them go upstairs to smoke. So we've got Rita, Breeze, Skeet, and Angela Acklin. They go upstairs, they smoke. After they finish smoking, Angela asked Cool Breeze if he had any more. She wanted more. They're splitting it 4 ways. And he says, no, I don't have any. Well, then Rita says, Breeze, you got to go. My boyfriend is going to be home any second. He's not going to be happy to see you here. Skeet got to stay. That's her brother. But Breeze has got to go. So he goes. Angela goes with him. Angela and Breeze leave together. Off they go. Breeze had asked Skeet if he would take him home, but Skeet said, I'm not going that way. Now, note here, Breeze does not live on this side of town. He lives on the, quote, nice side of town because his family had been in Decatur for a long time. They were a well-known family, and he did not live on that side of town. So he couldn't just up and go 2 blocks like everybody else could. So he was looking for a ride, and Skeet's like, no, I'm not driving all the way out there. So then, around 2 or 3 in the morning, Rita Hood goes outside. She notices all the police cars at Miss Tucker's house, again, 5 houses down. She had heard sirens a bit earlier, and she's thinking, oh, well, this has got to be related. And then they ask her this. They are talking about Angela. They're trying to find out more about Angela, who left with Cool Breeze. So we'll go back to me being the attorneys. Jen will be Rita. Who did she stay with?
I guess her husband.
Rudolph Acklin?
Yes.
Have you ever seen him?
Yeah.
Describe him for the jury.
He is short, dark, and stocky.
He's kind of broad, isn't he?
Stocky.
She is the one with the short and stocky and dark husband?
Yes.
So you can see what they're implying here. Either she and Breeze left Rita's, heading in the direction of Miss Tucker's house, or Breeze went home And she and her husband, Rudolph Acklin, a short, dark, stocky man, went to Miss Tucker's house. That's the implication that they're making here.
All right, guys, that was a huge bombshell. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a quick break. And when we return, we're going to talk about Rocky's time on the stand. All right, guys, welcome back. Now it's time to hear from Rocky himself. He is going to take the stand, which of course defendants don't normally do, but he chose to do this. Now, they talked about his skin condition. He talks about how it causes his skin to be dry and flaky, and he can rub his arm and it will just kind of peel off or crust off. It also caused him to lose his hair. They asked him what he was doing the day of the murder. Now, he says he was with his brother-in-law and they had made plans to go to a club. But Rocky didn't have any money and he was hoping that Donald would pay his way for him. He had money earlier that day, but he does admit that he had spent that on drugs. Donald said he wouldn't pay for his way because he didn't have the money either. But Rocky's mother-in-law called his wife and said, "Hey, do you want me to give Rocky some money?" Now, we're going to come back to why she did this a little bit later, but of course, Rocky's wife said yes.
And that'll be in the next episode, but it was not uncommon for Rocky to need money and Debbie, his wife, would be the one to give it to him.
She controlled the budget.
Yeah.
So whenever he needed it, she was going to make sure that they had it for him to actually to spend.
So Rocky put his kids in bed while his wife was at work, and he left Leandrew, who was about 12 at the time, in charge if needed. Donald's girlfriend's kids were there too, and she had an older daughter. So Rocky is at his in-laws' house, walks home with the kids, puts them in bed, goes back to Donald's house / his mother-in-law's house, and he asks him if he can borrow some clothes because he didn't have many of his own. He wanted to change clothes for the club. So he borrowed this brownish tan sweater with leather on it from Donald. He took the sweater back to his house. He said, "I'm going to go change. I'm going to get some of my clean jeans and put with this." So he goes home, puts on the sweater, puts on a black turtleneck underneath it and a better pair of jeans. Then he throws on a black jacket over it and he is ready to go. By this point, he goes back to the in-laws' house. Keep in mind, this is right behind his house. It's 1 block away, so he can just hop over there. But when he goes back, they had left. And Rocky's a bit irritated because he's like, they didn't wait for me. And he felt kind of like Donald's girlfriend had been rushing him. So he's like, well, what do I do now? They just ditched me. So he's like, I got to go back to my house. The kids are all there. I'll just go back. But the alley runs straight to the side of that. So to the left, if your back is facing the in-laws' house, to the left is the alley, which runs right down to Rocky's house. So Rocky takes the alley home, and this is the fateful moment. This is when he finds the VCR. He's going back home. They just left him. He's in this dark sweater that he borrowed from his brother-in-law, and lo and behold, there's a VCR.
He sees the VCR and he grabs it. This is when he sees all the police across the street, so he kind of creeps back a little bit. Here's exactly what Rocky says. "That's when I ran into this VCR. It was setting up under some bushes. It was pretty visible coming from that side of the house. That's when I ran into the thing. I looked at it, but I was looking at going back around to the side of the house to come to the front because I exit and enter my house through the back. I never used the front to go all the way around Moulton to 6. Now, 2 very key points here. This is the VCR in the bush. This is going to line up with the people in the car that see somebody stash, to their point, stereo equipment, because they didn't know what it was, under a bush because they had just yelled at them, "Hey, I bet you just stole that thing." So that's going to be back in chapter 1. Even Rocky says he never took the main roads to the shot house. "I take the alleyway. There's no need for me to go on the main road on Moulton. There's no need for me to be out there because It's shorter for me to go the back way.
Which is exactly what we said in the last episode. So that wasn't, like Jen said, that's not something that the defense or the prosecution brought up. That's just something Rocky said. So it wasn't like a big point that they were trying to make. That's just something Rocky said, and it just so happens to line up with what we said in the last episode. He had no reason to be on the corner. His house was right here, and that corner where his house was, there was no reason for that. There was this alley. Now, we know that Donald and his girlfriend wanted to leave around 11, but they were mad because they didn't leave until 11:30. That's what Donald said in his statement. So they left without Rocky. So Rocky goes back over there, not realizing that they had left without him. So the time would be about right. They left at 11:30. Rocky was not there. So he came back to that house sometime after 11:30, so putting it closer to 12. So then he says that once he finds it, he creeps back. He tossed it under the porch in the back where there was a little crawl space so he could go inside. So he's like, oh, a VCR. Oh, crap, there's a bunch of police. He throws it under his crawl space. And at this point, he does say that he specifically decided to go in the front door this time, which he does not normally do, because he was being nosy and he wanted to know what was going on. There's police across the street. So he goes through the front door and he stays on the porch for just a few minutes outside. Well, you're probably not going to do this if you just murdered someone. You're not just going to sit on your front porch right across the street when there's police swarming the place.
He went inside, he checked on his kids, and then decided to go down to Butch's to use the money his mother-in-law gave him. Then later, he was still wanting more. So he gets to his house when the police are there. That's the 12:19 mark. So it could be, he uses the money his mother-in-law gave him.
Which was supposed to be for the club, so we know he still had it. He did not go to the club.
This is not the VCR yet.
Right.
This is cash in hand. Then later, he is still wanting more. That's when he decided to trade the VCR. He says it's about 1 or 2 o'clock. Now, he can't exactly be sure of the time, of course, and even he says he can't be sure. However, it does line up with what other people say. So, say 12:30 or 1, he goes and gets the crack with cash. He leaves, he smokes it, he wants more. So now he goes back again with the VCR. This would line up with the 3 to 3:30 timeline.
And it does not line up at all with the timeline of the people in the car. Now, potentially they could have seen him there when he went to use the cash, maybe around 12:30-ish, he's...
The cash transaction and them pulling up, because remember, the liquor store closes at 12.
But also keep in mind, Rocky's recollection of time is not necessarily reliable. So if he says 1 or 2 o'clock, it could have been 12. It could have been 1:30. We talked about that in the last episode too. But that would line up closer to what Butch said about it being much, much later, as opposed to that 12 o'clock time frame where he showed up with the VCR coming straight from the street like everybody in the car said.
Now Rocky is back on the stand. He also flat out admits to selling the VCR. He says, yeah, I did it. He never tries to deny the VCR at all. So his defense brings this up. Lindsay, would you mind being the defense lawyer again?
I'll be the defense, and Jen will be Rocky. Mr. Burrell, which is the prosecutor, says that you owned up to touching that VCR after Officer Tilley told you they had found some prints. That's true, isn't it? They told you they found some prints, so you knew you needed to tell them you touched the VCR. And that's when you told the truth, isn't it, Rocky?
That's right.
They also offered you a chance to say you had been in the house.
They said they found prints in the house.
But you still said you were never in there?
That's right.
So if you were being so smart, as they would like the jury to believe, could you have said, yeah, I was in the house. I used her telephone to call for pizza or something?
I could have.
But you admitted to them that you had touched that VCR because you had pawned it, right?
Yes.
And you knew your prints might be on it, right?
Yeah.
And you knew there was no way in the world they could be in that house.
That's right.
You've never been in that house in your life?
No.
So basically what they're saying is if you had actually touched the phone, you could have come up with a reason. She was your neighbor. You could have said, yeah, I did use her phone if you knew they were going to find your prints there, like they were going to find on this VCR. You could have come up with it. You could have come up with a reason why, and you didn't.
Next up is Rudolph Acklin. Now remember, this is the husband of Angela. Now she was the one that made the anonymous call to the police implicating Cool Breeze. He testifies very quickly, long enough to say that he doesn't know where Angela is. This would make more sense in a moment, so just hold on here. The police dispatcher, Alice Evans, is next. She basically just confirms all the officers arrived on the scene, and they did it very quickly. So next is Angela Acklin, the woman who made the police call. She said that she saw Cool Breeze that night. Well, at least it's supposed to be Angela Acklin. Except the day before she was supposed to testify, she totally disappears. Doesn't show up, doesn't know where she is, and this is why her husband testifies. She's also the same one who hung up the first time she had called the police. So very weird.
When Rudolph Acklin testified, he did say that she was a heavy drug and alcohol user. So they're thinking maybe she was just scared. But everyone up there at that point was. They all were. And they all made it through just fine. They're all fine. They were all at the shot house. There were people selling drugs. And they showed up. So what's up with that? There are theories out there. Nothing is proven. We'll get to some of those later. However, she is a very, very important witness because she is the one who called the police. So they do at least let her original statement be read in court for the jury to hear. Normally wouldn't do this, but we are going to read the statement just since she is such a crucial witness. Pay close attention if you can, because there's something really weird about this that we will get to after.
Her statement reads as follows. On Friday night, October 4th, 1991, I was watching television with my husband, Rudolph Acklin. We watched Tales from the Crypt on HBO until 11:30. Rudolph went to bed, and I went and sat on the front porch. I went in and out a couple of times. I was sitting on the porch when I heard my dog start crying. I looked up 7th Avenue towards Moulton Street. I saw a black male run across 7th Avenue between the house next to me and the church on the other side. He was wearing a white shirt and black jeans. When he got under the streetlight, I could see what looked like blood on the front of his shirt. I recognized the man as the guy I know as Breeze. Some people call him Cool Breeze. Breeze ran across the street towards the alley. I just sat there on my porch. After a while, I started seeing a lot of police cars on the street shining their lights. I got curious and walked over to my friend's house across the alley on 6th Avenue Southwest. I talked to my friend and her husband for about 45 minutes to an hour. Then I left their house. I could still see police around. I got curious and went up north up the alley. I crossed 1st Street Southwest towards Moulton Street. About halfway up the alley, I saw Breeze standing there. He was just standing there looking back east. When Breeze saw who I was, he walked toward me. We started talking. I asked him about the blood on his shirt. Breeze said that he had hooked up with someone and they had a misunderstanding about some dope. Breeze said they had done him wrong, then would not take him home. Breeze said that he had closed a door on his finger and it hurt. Breeze said that he had been wiping the blood from his hand on his shirt. Breeze tried to get me to get in my car to take him home, but I wouldn't do it. I walked up Moulton and 7th. Breeze started to follow me, and I told him if he wanted a ride to go see my husband. I left Breeze in the alley. I don't know which way he went. When I got to Moulton and 7th and found out what had happened, I came back home. On Sunday night, October 6th, 1991, I called the police, anonymously, and told them what I seen. Sergeant Coker came to my house Tuesday morning, October 8th, 1991, and I talked to him about what I've seen. About 12:50 p.m., Sergeant Coker came back and showed me some pictures of several black males. I identified one of them as Breeze, the man I had seen in the alley that night. This statement was written for me by Sergeant Croker, but the words, thoughts, are my own.
Okay, there is a lot to unpack here. So remember, she called twice, hung up the first time, then called back. She is the one who brought Breeze into this situation. She didn't claim to have seen him at the shot house with the VCR or anything like that, like we've heard other people say. This was completely aside from that whole shot house scene. So she sees him after 11:30 because they were watching TV. She and her husband watching TV, heading in the direction of Miss Tucker's house. He had basically said he was involved in a bad drug deal, probably meaning they didn't give him what he paid for or something like that. We don't know if this was at Butch's or not, but we do know that he had asked Butch for credit earlier. So perhaps he tried it with someone else and they had beat him up, wasn't going to fly, who knows. But if he were Miss Tucker's killer, the killer came to the door saying that he had been in a fight. So could that be relevant? But let's go back for just a minute. I want to speculate for just a second before we get to the big bombshell about this. One thing that has always sat really weird with me is that Miss Tucker's door was left wide open because it seems like that would have called attention to the scene sooner than necessary. If you just robbed someone, whatever, you're trying to get away quick, but you're going to try to not make it obvious. For all the killer knew, both of the women were dead. So leaving the door open on purpose would have given him less getaway time because it would have highlighted that there was an issue there. I kept thinking that he probably had the VCR under his arm, so it was kind of awkward and just didn't close the door properly. But then Breeze says, according to Angela, that he slammed his finger in a door and hurt it, and that's why it was bleeding. And for some reason, when I heard that, in my head, it was just like this light bulb. He's not convicted. He may not be guilty, but in my mind, it was just like a puzzle piece. So assume for a second that it was Breeze. Just pretend. This actually all fits because Butch won't deal to him on credit. He's desperate, maybe a little beat up. He goes to Miss Tucker's, gets the VCR, slams his finger in the door on the way out, so the door bounces back open. And that's why that door was open. That's why his finger is cut. The police arrive super fast, so he panics, throws the VCR under a bush in the alley, and takes off. Meanwhile, Rocky is walking home, comes through the alley, sees the VCR, and takes it. That's just something about him saying that he slammed his finger in a door, it just, for some reason, I was like, oh, that's what happened to his hand.
But here's the weird thing about all of this. Angela's statement says that she was with her husband watching TV. Rita Hood's statement suggests otherwise. Remember, she said Angela came running up with a torn dress. They smoked together. She and Breeze left together shortly before midnight. Now, to be specific, Rita said she expected her boyfriend home anytime after 10:30 or 11. She was surprised when he wasn't already there when they all walked up. Also, she was the one with the Cordova. Others testified to seeing him in this Cordova, so we know he was with them. And she said they were at the shot house at 11, hence why she was surprised her boyfriend wasn't home yet.
Is it likely that Angela just happened to see Cool Breeze in this alley running past her house? No, she gives this statement to police. She calls police and says, I'm at home, or I was at home watching TV with my husband, and here's what happened. She wasn't. She wasn't at home watching TV with her husband. And we can assume that Rita Hood is telling the truth because, again, she had the Cordova, and multiple people saw the Cordova. They saw Breeze in the car with a bunch of other people who stopped by just for a few minutes, grabbed a drink, and then they went on their way. That's them. That's these people. And then now she's saying Angela Ackland shows up at her house in a ripped dress, out of breath, and they smoked, and then she left with Breeze. Angela wasn't at her house watching Tales from the Crypt. But she said they were watching that until 11:30, which would mean it came on at 11. We know she's at Rita's house. So the whole statement she gave police doesn't add up. She's with the main suspect until Rocky came along. So let's speculate a little bit more with what we've just learned. Again, just speculation. But this is actually one of the theories we referred to earlier. It's the defense actually alludes to it in their closing statements. But again, it is not proven. Breeze and Angela leave Rita Hood's apartment. They want more drugs, which Rita says Angela asked about. But neither have money. They develop a plan. They're going to try to get some collateral. They go to Miss Tucker's. We're 5 houses away. Rita is 5 houses away. Perhaps maybe they even stopped at some of the other houses along the way, saw somebody was home or somebody was awake or whatever. Because remember, there are a few sets of prints on the side of Miss Tucker's house leading to the alley. So maybe Angela or Breeze is looking through that window on the side of the house where the footprints are going, trying to see what's inside or who's there. Are they awake? Are they asleep? And is being a lookout. Let's say Breeze goes up. He's pretending to be injured. Angela's over here thinking it's just a robbery. It goes wrong. He comes out with blood on him. And she's like, holy crap, that's not what I was bargaining for. She panics and she reports it, which would be why she hung up the first time. But oh my God, I still have to tell what happened. She calls back and then doesn't show up in court because maybe, just maybe, it's because she knew more.
Maybe he really did slam his finger in Miss Tucker's door, and that's why Angela said it slammed in a door to begin with. So in other words, if Breeze didn't tell her, but she saw it, and that's how she knows. But what we can't figure out is why her dress is torn before she ran up to Rita's house. We have no backstory on what happened to her prior to her coming up to the apartment or house. Also, where her house is, her story doesn't make any sense. She couldn't see the police from her house.
So think back to what we said this town looks like. We remember how I said there's that lowercase t. Rocky is in that top right corner. Miss Tucker's in the bottom right corner. Angela Ackland's house is going to be in our left quadrant, way down. You know how 6th Street kind of cuts down the middle? How we said it cuts right down the middle? Angela's is way down on 7th. So bump one over from our straight down through the middle of the T. But she's way down. And she is saying, and again, we'll post maps in the discussion group, which we did for the last one, but this will all make more sense when you can see it. But her house was 1 block to the left and 2 blocks down from Miss Tucker. But she's saying that she goes out on her porch, she's sitting out there, sees Cool Breeze run by, and sees the police at Miss Tucker's house. Where her house is, she can't see Miss Tucker's house from her house. And she's got Breeze down there with her, cutting through her yard, way down there at the bottom of the map, when we know that they left Rita Hood's house together. Also, Breeze lives on the other side of town, which is why he kept asking people for a ride home. So how did he get home? Nobody has testified saying we gave Breeze a ride home. He couldn't have walked. How did he get home? Did he stay with someone, or is someone just not saying?
Where did he crash that night? Because now it's 3, 4, 5 a.m. All right, last up. Let's talk about John Boyd. This is one of the Decatur detectives, chief investigator on the case. He talks all about the fingerprints that they did. None of them matched to anyone in this case. The VCR was printed. They could only get 1 partial palm print. Now, the rest were unusable, but that palm print did not ever match Rocky. So let's just stop for a second. We're at Miss Tucker's house. No hair on her, except for the one we discussed, which could possibly be hers. There is no blood from anyone else than the victim. No prints. No skin. The officers who questioned him remember seeing it peel and flake in the interview. He is sitting there in the police station interviewing, and he's leaving skin cells. But yet none were at the scene. He says how they took the pants and the shirt that had been mentioned earlier and a pocket knife and a jogging suit and another pair of blue jeans and an oily rag from Breeze's home. Now, really important here. At this point, no one knows for sure if that's what Breeze was wearing that night. He never said anything about what he was wearing.
They said we saw him wearing a white shirt, but they never said, was it this one?
Yeah, they alluded to the coloring, but they never specifically said it was this one. It was never positively identified.
Now, John Boyd, who is on the stand now, also says that when Cool Breeze was arrested, he didn't see any injuries on his body. However, we already talked about that picture that was in evidence that did show an injury on his knuckle. He also admits that Butch had mentioned Rocky. But at that time, he had these other statements, and he was just convinced that it was Valentine. So he did not make any notes about Butch mentioning Rocky in the file. So he walks through Breeze's original statement because he's the one who questioned him. And he talks about how Breeze randomly said out of nowhere, "You can check my clothes, you won't find any blood on them," which we brought that up as well. They hadn't mentioned blood yet or anything, so they thought it was weird. But maybe he knew because, again, all the articles that were out at that time said she had been stabbed. So it's not a huge leap to say there would have been blood. But Boyd actually tallied up the number of times that Cool Breeze lied that they could actually prove in the statement and came up with 21 total lies that he told in his statement that were now provable.
Now, speaking of random statements, they talked about how Rocky said he never touched Miss Tucker's phone. So, Lindsay, would you do the honor once more as an attorney?
Sure. There have been a number of stories in the Decatur Daily concerning what happened to Ludie Mae Tucker.
I think that's correct, yes.
And one of these articles, or at least one of them, indicated the circumstances under which her killer had obtained entrance to her home.
If you were asking me if I had an independent recollection of that, I do not. If you have a paper, I'd be glad to look over it.
I'll be more specific. Do you recall seeing a newspaper article to the effect that the person who had killed Ludie Mae Tucker had come into her home under the pretext of wanting to use a telephone?
I do not recall.
Well, Mr. Boyd may not have been able to recall whether or not any of the newspaper articles mentioned the telephone because, you know, he's trying to say, oh, Rocky seemed really suspicious because he said I never touched her telephone. However, Corpus Delicti did find articles that mentioned it. For example, there's one right here from October 6th. That's just the day after Miss Tucker was killed. And it states, quote, "As police reconstructed events, the women had retired for the night, but may have been awake when someone knocked. Mrs. Tucker apparently opened the door when the man said he had been injured in a fight and needed to use the telephone." So that proves what we were talking about earlier, that it was common knowledge that the phone would have been involved in this case. So whether Rocky saw it in the newspaper, on the news, whether people were talking about it, that was not a secret.
Now, that's all the witnesses that happened during this trial, and they're going to go into closing statements. But before we wrap up the trial, we're going to wrap up this episode. And while you may think you know what's coming next in the closing statements and jury deliberations based on what you already know has happened, you guys are in for one big surprise. All right, guys, we have alluded to this before, and now we have it. We are setting up a mail template, so a letter template, are on our Facebook group and in our private group, as well as our public page, that if you want it, you can get it and start getting those letters written, or you can create one yourself.
Basically, we talked with his lawyer and investigator, and they gave us a specific set of what they need, which is amazing. And at some point, part of the process will be they will be allowed to file for clemency, which is where they will put together a clemency package, present it to Governor Ivey, and hope that she will change his sentence from death to life without parole. Because of that, because it's part of the process, they told us what they need. What we will ask if you write a letter is use a generic address to the governor. Don't say Governor Ivey, just say governor, because we don't know if she will still be in office at the time. If you are from the state of Alabama, Please make that known, because Governor Ivey in particular, if it does end up being Governor Ivey, puts particular emphasis on residents of Alabama. We want letters from everywhere. We need letters from everywhere, but we want to put the Alabama ones on top so that she can see what her residents are saying. If you cannot mail the letter for some reason, please send it to our P.O. box. But if you cannot, you can email it to us, but try to sign it. You know how on your phone you can kind of screenshot and then you can kind of mark it? You can use the little markup feature and kind of sign it. At least try to get your signature on there so that it looks like somebody didn't just type it up for you. And you can email it to us. But we would prefer to have like a handwritten where we can see, the signature and all that on there. If you're going to email it, send it to Corpus Delicti at yahoo.com. It's Corpus Delicti. It's not Delecti. A lot of people do that. It's Deli. If you are going to mail it, it is P.O. Box 89, Chelsea, Alabama, 35043. And just, if it's emailed or whatever, put in the subject line that we know that it's for Rocky. If you want to use a template, come in the group. We do have a template made that we will post there. Feel free to use that if you don't know what to say. But, if you're passionate about it, put whatever facts in there that you think are relevant.
And we can pin that to the top.
Yes, for sure. So it's easy to find.
You will definitely see it.
Yeah.
Again, we are highly encouraging, if this story has moved you like it has moved us, please send the letter. But we're just not telling all of our listeners, do it no matter what. Coming up soon, we are going to have a live feed for all of our listeners, not just our Patreon. We're going to do something special for them to kind of make up for this. But instead of doing our Patreon live feed, we are going to do an open call where we're going to be answering your questions about this case and anything else that you can think of. If you want to know more about these court documents or Rocky himself, Lindsay and I have corresponded with him. So I've got a few letters that I have not read on the show because I don't feel like it's the place or the medium for that. But if you guys want to hop on and talk to us, you're more than welcome to. Yeah, it's March 31st at 7 p.m. Central.
And we'll post the link for it probably that day. We usually do it that day just so it doesn't float out all over the place. So follow us on social media because we will post it there. Speaking of Patreon, though, and how we're not doing the call this month, but we're doing other stuff, we do have some new Patreon supporters that we want to welcome.
Yeah, welcome Amy and welcome Santosh. I'm sorry if I mispronounced that, but super appreciated. Love it. Thank you so much for supporting the show. Everything that y'all provide to the show now will go straight back into Rocky's case, whether it's envelopes or paper to print out a lot of the stuff. We greatly appreciate it. But until the live feed and until the next chapter in our story with Rocky and the road to redemption, y'all have a great one. Stay safe. Bye.
Bye.